Just one second. Thank you so much, Ken, for the warm introduction. I think you've done, you've said what I wanted to say in my introduction, so there's no need for me to repeat what you have already said. As Ken has mentioned, that I'll be presenting on my PhD, which I did in the Department of Social Economy. I looked at Gurans violence, which is dominated in Black townships in Cape Town, which used culture as a case study. And I'm sure some of you will be asking, why did you use culture as a case study? Because culture has been under commission of inquiry for some time. And also a lot of violence, which manifests in different ways, culture has been one of those townships that have been affected. But I'll explain more on that as I proceed with my presentation. First, I'd just like to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about, the background of the study, the brief literature review of what has been done under the subject of youth violence, specifically looking at Cape Town, and also the gap. What is the gap that my study is trying to fill in the literature, and also the research questions that I used in order to answer my assumptions about the subject that I studied, and also theories that I've used and methods and key findings of my study. But in the key findings of my study, I'll be actually trying to focus on one question of the question that I've asked when I was doing this research, and also just to look at the main contribution of the study. Background of the study, why I did the study. I think, as we all know, that South Africa is one of the countries that are embedded with the high rate of violence, and which manifests in different ways. I mean, we have had news reports, we have read newspapers, in social media, people are talking about the high rate of violence in South Africa, especially looking at townships, where people have experienced this violence, and some of them, they have witnessed it. I mean, we've seen gender-based violence, we have seen xenophobia, and lately we've seen the zamazamas as well that they've spoken about, hearing from the news. And also, we have seen how this violence has contributed to homicide, injuries, and I mean, the health sector has had so many admissions of people coming in and out because they've been having injuries because of violence, and had also the homicides. And also amongst this violence that we have seen on television and also social media, also young people have been part of that, of the violence under the age of 24 years of age. And those young people have also been the victims, they've been also as well perpetrators of the violence that we're talking about. And some of them, they've been associated with gangs, right, related activities. And looking at those statistics, those stats that we have seen on television, we ask ourselves, why so many young people from the ages of like 14 to 24 have been involved in violence? Is there a need, or is that a cry for help? Is there a need, do they need protection, shelter, or do they need guidance from the older generation? Or it's the sense of belonging, trying to find their identity, trying to find a place where they feel they belong, or it's just pride and honor. Also, the communities, because we cannot isolate young people from the communities that they live in. They also are part of those communities that this violence is taking place. So we ask ourselves that what makes a certain individual violent? And also what makes certain communities to be violent than other communities, but they belong in the same country or the same city. And also, which means this then, it requires a long term investment of research, which as scholars and other disciplines, we need to be something that we need to be looking at as a matter of urgency. So I also looked, I think Emily should have assisted me, technically challenged. So as I've mentioned, there's literature that has been done regarding gang-related violence, as we know that there's a very rich history on violence in South Africa. I'm not talking about now the democratic South Africa that we're in right now. I mean, we know the history, apartheid, and how also young people have taken a huge part in the resistance of the apartheid government, which they used violence as a form of trying to resist the government. So we know that, I mean, we have scholars like Professor Ivan Keynes, who's here amongst us, and Don Pinox, who have done a lot of work in that aspect, specifically looking at the gang groups, right? Looking at the culture of the rituals of gangs, and also looking at what it means for young people who belong in violent activities. And also not only looking at gang violence that we see in colored communities, which we understand is the culture, right? We've always understood and aware that gang violence that we see in colored communities has always been associated being a culture, something that has been there for generations. And now young people growing up there, they're starting to learn the techniques and how to join gang groupings in those communities. And also some scholars, they've also looked at youth violence in the townships that I've looked at as well, Kylie few scholars like Catherine White, they've looked at that and trying to understand and answer questions on what is the impact of youth violence in those communities, why young people are in secondary schooling involved in violence, and how can the policies be revised and try to shape the intervention that have been put in place in order to fight against violence that are seen in those communities. So I feel that those studies have paved the way for me, right, in order for me to find my gap. Then understanding that, yes, we all know that there's been gang violence that has been happening for years, permanent structures, organized crime, right? And more of those violence have looked at the benefits of these gang groups that young people join. And also they've looked at the rituals, the culture, drug-related matters in those gang groupings. But in my position, with understanding and acknowledging that literature, I wanted to understand more, to just get insight on those young people who are involved in this violence, trying to understand not only why are they increasing violence in those communities, but trying to understand what is this violence? Is this different from the gangs that has been researched? Is it different from other manifestations of violence that have been studied by other scholars? So then I took a leap of faith in my mind, thinking that, okay, this is a gap, actually, something that should be and is worth to be studied, which I came across Gurans, which is a vernacular language that is used in those Black townships. Gurans, which is a match between young boys who are living in the same township, but within different locations of that township. For example, young people are staying, because Kutch is a very huge township, right? Young people from side C will fight young people from side B. and having different names associated with their groups, the groups that they belong to. So it's not a matter of choice that you become part of those groups. It's a matter of the location that you reside in. So where is the gap? So that's the question that I ask myself. Where is the gap? Yes, youth violence has been studied. People know about it. People know about gang groups. And the same young people that you're researching about have been always associated with gang groupings. So what's the difference? So the difference between what I was, the gap that I saw in the literature was that we needed to understand what is this. Besides of this gang affecting the members of the community, these young people called Izipoli, called robbers, called muggers, that some people that are not even, have always been given the stigma that they are not part of the community, they're just hooligans, a lost generation. But what is this? What makes these young people to act so violently? I mean, these groups that they belong to is like social groups that if I decide to just join a certain group within my community, whether it's a Stockville, but this kind of group that these young people who are secondary schooling, young boys between the age of 14 to 21. For some of these young people, they repeat grades and they end up staying longer than is expected in secondary school. So what are these youth social interaction and the dynamics within the groups these young people belong to? So how I did that, I wanted also to have a critical engagement with the community members, to have a critical engagement with the affected youth. Affected youth are totally different from the youth that will partake in this violence. Affected youth are those young people who are not part of the violence, but staying within the same community. And also, I didn't want to stop at looking only on the community members, looking at the crew members, which is crew members are part of these young people who are partaking in this violence. But I also wanted to look at the schools where these young people are going to. I wanted to understand how these people understand this phenomena. Do they understand it, or they just understand it as just, this is youth violence. We all know that is happening in these communities, so there's nothing new about it. So I wanted to understand how their understanding and their experiences and perspective on that. And also the role of the stakeholders, which include youth themselves, the community, and the schools, who is responsible and involved in perpetuating this kind of violence in this community. And also, what is the response of the community? Yes, we have seen communities, and communities have been looked at kind of victims in terms of how these young people have they've created a violent set up within their communities, and communities have been seen as victims of this violence. So I wanted to check how is the community responding to this? What is their take in making sure that there are measures that are being applied in fighting against Gurans? And as you can see in the picture, this picture was taken by one of the principals in those schools, the one that you can see the sharp objects and the alcohol that is there. So he took those weapons in the cupboard in his office, and was like, this is how the situation is in these schools. Also, these young people, it was taken in one of the schools as well, showing some of the things that they carry, and also some muti, etc., which is something that I won't be talking about today. It's worth another seminar. As I've already explained, that I'll be only concentrating on one question. And this is how, also the picture down on the bottom, also how they engage with each other when they're doing their fights. I almost said it's highlighted on me. I would like to play a video for you. I mean, probably some of you have watched it, you know all about it, just to give you a bit of a description of the Gurans. I hope the volume is.
Choosing an education could mean risking your life for these Kailicha youths. These boys say it's not worth it. It's been more than 6 weeks since they set foot in their school. This 17-year-old says he was attacked by a gang who broke his elbow.
I'm scared of the gangs that attack us on the way to and from school. It's been a month since I've attended school. I was attacked on my way there. They hit me with a spade.
This 18-year-old has since dropped out of school.
This gang thing is not new. I was stabbed and spent 8 months in hospital. I gave up on school because each time when I went back there, the gangs would go looking for us at school again.
This boy too says he won't go back to school.
In July, they stabbed me in the arm. I spent 2 months in hospital, and this week again, they beat me up.
The spat is all about territory and power. Girls are also not spared in the ongoing fights.
The other day, I was slapped in the face and asked which group I belonged to. The guy kicked me, and that really hurt. We stayed away from school for a week because we were scared. But now I'm forced to go because I'm writing grade 12 exams.
Parents are calling on anyone who can to help them.
It's been 3 weeks since my son went to school. We need the army because the police are also scared of these gangs.
We used to go fetch them at school, but we have since stopped because we are also scared after these gangs attacked them in front of us and pelted us with stones.
Teachers at this school say they fear for their lives and those of the pupils after a grade 8 pupil was stabbed outside the school. Kailicha, Cape Town.
At least you have just some brief understanding of these Gurans. And I would just like to highlight also one of the reasons why I decided to do the study. My motivation behind it was because I grew up in Kailicha and I've seen this kind of violence taking place, and also because my brother was killed because of this the violence with his friend. He was trying to, in 2010, he was trying to help his friend when they were attacked by a group of young boys from sightseeing. And while he was trying to help his friend, he was also killed. So that was one of the reasons why I drew interest in it and tried and wanted to investigate about it. So these are the questions. These are not I just summarized the questions that I've asked in my dissertation. And the one that is highlighted red is the one that I'll be talking more about today. Trying to understand this phenomena, which is Gurans, and also the impact it had on the community, and also how the community has responded to it, and looking at the measures that the community has taken in order to mitigate the Gurans in their communities, in the community of Kailicha. So I used 2 theories for my study, which I felt that they would really help me understand and answer some of the questions that I had about this phenomena, which is Gurans. I use violentization theory, which the theory is Lonnie Evans, who did studies in trying to understand why certain individuals become violent than others, which he looked at different stages of how people develop in being violent, which there were 4 stages that he looked at, which is teaching and demonstration of violence and how people progress in becoming violent until they get into the stage of becoming dangerous, violent criminals. And also, he didn't stop at looking at the individual itself, but he looked at the community that these young people reside in, what kind of communities that, what is the contribution of the community that these young people. But I'm not going to dwell on that. I just wanted to give you a brief understanding of the theories that underpin my study. And also social identity theory, which I felt these individuals, they also belong in certain groups. And what makes these young people to join certain groups? Is it about finding a home, or is it just about identity and belonging, or it's just social groups that you find in your community and decide to join them? So I felt that these two theories, they really speak to my study, because these young people are involved in these in Gurans. They are part of the community, also at the same time they're individuals. I think Kelly mentioned that in the beginning about the methods. I will try to just briefly just to take you through, like looking at the criteria that I've used gaining entry. Which is, gaining entry was one of the toughest things that I had to do in this study, because I had a problem with ethical clearance. And also after I was given permission to take the study, but at the same time, when I got to those communities, people were not keen to partake, because they felt that it was risky for them. If they are seen talking to me, it might risk their lives, and these young boys might target them. So initially in my study, I wanted to do individual focus, three focus groups with the affected youth, educators, and community members. I only wanted individual interviews with the crew members, because I felt it was safe for them to have individual interviews rather than focus groups. Also, just to give just a brief of the profile of the youth, I wanted to understand, when did these young people started this violence, because I felt it was really important for my study. The age where they started and where they are right now. But if you notice, the 24-year-old, he already stopped at the time of the interview, because he felt like he was done with it, even though it was still affecting him, he was still being chased, but he felt that he's no longer young, belonging in that group and being part of the young people. So, but when he started, he was 18. But as you can see, the youngest to join Gurans was 12 years, which shows that he was still in primary school when he joined Gurans. And the oldest to join Gurans, he was 18, which is Ulubabalo, a 24-year-old. And most of them, they've dropped out because of, as you have seen in the video as well, some of these young people drop out of school because they feared for their life, because the schools, they were in the territory of their opponents. Key findings, meanings behind Gurans. So these young people, they explained to me that this Gurans has been something that has, which is some of the quotes I've not put in my presentation, but one of the young people as well mentioned that this Gurans started around 2000. Started in Site C, where they were fighting in trains, where they were fighting each other. But this one is mentioning that Gurans started in Kuala, and then it became an internal thing in Kailicha, where now different groups from within culture started fighting each other, depending on the location that they reside in. And also, according to this, Gurans is about weapons they carry. I mean, when you speak about sharp weapons or besides guns, weapons, they've been in existence. They've been used by young people. As I've mentioned, that South Africa has always been embedded by, it's been having this violent culture where Abotsotsi, Amalaiti have used such similar weapons. But for them, in my argument, it was more of a legitimate reason why they created those groups as part of resistance to the apartheid government. But you look at these young people using the same weapons, but killing each other. Not fighting people outside their community, but fighting amongst themselves with no reason behind their fights. And also, speaking about territory, I mean, when territory conflicts among gang groups, which is something that also has been studied, it's been something that has been in existence for a long period. But now, looking at those territory conflicts, looking gangs in colored communities is more of economic benefits. It's more of status. It's more of who has power than the other. But now, looking at these young people, why are they fighting for a territory? Why are they using sharp weapons to kill each other for no reason? To them, it's a game. Motivation to join, loyalty. Some of these young people, one of them is saying, I decided to join because my brother and this other boy that was murdered from BM section, he was killed in H section. You see the different location within. They chased him until they got him. Also, his head was chopped off. I wanted revenge because this boy was innocent. This narrative is actually demonstrating that the young boy that was killed, and including his brother, they were innocent. They were not part of Gurans. But because they belong in certain location, that is how they got affected and got killed. And also, these young people mentioning that it's not nice to see your friend being killed in front of you, or to hear that your friend was killed. So the only way to avenge is to also join Gurans. It's not a matter of choice, or you want to, or you choose certain groups, but your location determines which group to join. And also, these young people have experienced Gurans themselves. They've been chased, they've been hospitalized because of Gurans, even though they never belonged to it, but because they stayed in certain locations. Also, the same way I think you have heard from the video that I played, because you studied in a certain school, also that is within the territory of your opponents, that as well means that you'll be chased on your way to school or going back home. So it's not a matter of saying, guys, I need a membership. Okay, let me join, raise the card. But it's a matter of that you belong to a certain place. Then you're going to be attacked, whether you like it. It's either you join or you get killed while walking alone. Also, there's a sense of solidarity. Sense of solidarity in terms of young people fighting each other's battles. Seeing each other being killed in front of them, seeing each other. Sorry, can I have water? As I was mentioning that, so there's a sense of solidarity amongst the young people who are fighting each other's battles. As I've mentioned earlier on, that some of them, also based on the theory that I've used, some young people who joined certain groups, they joined because they are loyal, they have loyalty within those groups, or they are building a sense of solidarity amongst themselves. So from someone's outside, from outside point of view, like someone who's a spectator from the outside who's not part of these Gurans, they would think that these young people, they have no remorse. Some of them, they lack emotions. Like, for example, this code that I've highlighted, right, is from the youth that were affected but not part of Gurans, who are mentioning that when they look at Gurans, these young people, they kill each other like they're killing chickens. It's like there's no remorse whatsoever. They don't care of shedding of blood. But if you see at the bottom, these two narratives from these young people, they're mentioning that in terms of their emotion and how this has affected them psychologically, is that they cannot sleep at night. It's affecting them. The memories is haunting them. Their memories come back. And that is why some of them, they decide to stay longer than anticipated. Also, the fear of what will happen tomorrow. What will happen? Will I be killed the same way that my friend was killed? Will I be killed the same way that my brother was killed or slaughtered in front of me? So the only way for me to avoid being killed is either I drop out of school or I become absent from school, because I'm fearing that even inside school premises, I'll be killed. Way forward. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the slides of the way forward. Sorry about that. So what is the gap? The gap of what my study tried to fill was these young people, as much as we look at them as the organized structure, like we see in gang communities, but this is not an organized structure. This is not permanent, it's seasonal. It comes and goes. And also these young people are not recruited, but they join as a matter of survival. It's not a matter of choice that I want to be part of this group, I want to be part of Gurans, I want to be part of Vatos, but your location, as I've already mentioned, determines that you become part of a certain group within Kailicha. And also there are no elders, or they're all young, secondary schooling, young boys between the age of 14 to 24. There's no one who's leading them, who's training them, but they train themselves as young as they are. And also it comes, as I've mentioned, it's certain time of the year when it happens. During matric balls when a young person is finishing, for example, grade 7 in primary school or grade 12 in high school. And also during weekends on a Friday, and also during school holidays. That's when it happens. And there are certain locations these young people meet, under the bridge, which divides their location where they reside. So they'll meet there at a certain time, they WhatsApp each other that this is time we need to go and fight. So that's what they do. And also, it is a game. It is for fun. It is check who's who has the power. It is about status. Also, it is about the sense of safety. So the question that I would like to pose on people, do you think this is a gang? Or it's just young people who are just having fun, who are just having pleasure of killing each other, or who have just learned certain tricks from the old dogs? What is it exactly? So I'm posing that to you. I'm not going to answer it. Just for us to have a discussion on that. What is the way forward? What needs to change? Do we look at the effectiveness of the approaches that we have currently that have been used to reduce violence in these communities? Do we need to look at the interventions that have been put, plenty of interventions in order to help and those communities that are faced with violence? And also something that I would like to say, I believe that we should not use a blanket approach in order to fight youth violence, because each community violence manifests differently. And also looking at the bottom-up approach, using bottom-up approach, grounded in local understanding and meanings of violence. How do these communities understand violence? What would they like for the policies? How would they like the policy to be drafted in order to fight against violence? And also trying to understand from the perspective of these young people, why do they engage in violent activities? Opportunity should be given to those young people, not to sit down and make policies on behalf of them without them being consulted. Because most of the time, young people have been seen as perpetrators, have been isolated in their communities. There's always been this stigma that they're ruining the reputation of the community. But what has the community done in making sure that they make those young people to feel that they belong in those communities? What are the solutions that we need to put in place in order to understand how violence manifests in different communities? What I have not presented on, which I mentioned earlier on, that I only concentrated on one question that I looked at in my study. So part of the questions that I've asked, and also looking at the impact that youth violence has and the measures that have been taken by the communities, there's still a huge discussion that is needed in terms of, because I found out that there's a lot that the community is doing in contributing, in perpetuating this violence in those communities. Girls as instigators, looking at also the role of traditional healers, which is a huge one, the role of traditional healers making this violence to increase rather than to reduce. Also the impact in schools, how schools have been affected by this violence, hearing from the perspective of the educators as well, and also the impact on lives after this has happened. I would like to thank everyone for taking time. I was feeling anxious, I still am, but thank you so much for taking time to listen to my research findings, and I hope that I didn't stutter much so that you miss the points that I was trying to put across. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Sisanda. That was a really, really interesting conversation. And I think that last slide of yours shows us the next, 6 monthly seminars that you can do for us, one each on one of those themes, because I think that to hear more about that would even continue the conversation in a really productive way. I can see that Andrew Fall has been, as always, quick on the draw. His hand is up first on my screen. Andrew, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Kelly. Thanks, Sisanda. Very interesting. I have lots of questions, but I will just limit it to one for now. In terms of your provocation towards the end, in terms of, is this a gang? The one thing which I didn't see on your slide as a descriptor of these groups was a sense of identity. And yet I feel like the way you were talking about them was, we live in a certain place, we have a name, and that is a sense of identity. And I wondered if you could reflect a bit on that. I think in terms of adolescence, teenagers are generally searching for identity. It's a time when we're lost and so we're vulnerable. And I would think that that's part of the trappings of what is a form of youth gang, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on the role of identity in this group formation. Thanks very much.
Go ahead, Roberta.
Thank you so much for a very informative presentation. I'm just a bit curious about the cultural roots of violence in African societies. For example, stick fighting is something that was quite part of the culture for young boys. And it was sort of like violence was seen as something that does belong in our culture, but sort of channeled in a particular direction to serve, protect. Do you think maybe that this is something that has always been there, but sort of has lost its relevance given the context that we're living in right now?
Sisanda, do you want to take those two questions and then we'll go over to others? You can say, I think.
Okay. Just to answer Andrew's question about in terms of the sense of identity in the group formation of these young people, in terms of this, according to how these young people see Gurans, is that so locations and the names attached to those locations play a bigger role in young people, how they form those groups they belong in. So if, for example, if you stay, which is something, I mean, we've seen in gangs in the colored communities where if you are 26, there are street gangs, 26 and so forth. But in this case, these young people, your location determined, as I've mentioned, determined which group that you belong in. So if you are staying, for example, inside B, then you belong to Gurans. If you are staying inside C, then you belong to Italians or Vatos. So that is that sense of identity, how they identify themselves as their group formation within the set, how their groups have been set up of their groups. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it is answered.
And Norwegian's question
Okay.
about kind of cultural roots.
Yes. I think it has changed, the meanings have changed. So as you have mentioned, I think I've mentioned as well that this using sharp objects to fight, it has happened before during the apartheid, right? But it was more of using that as a resistance against the apartheid government. And also looking at the culture, the Black culture, where sticks are still happening actually in the rural areas, in villages, where young men, older people will put young men in a circle where they need to fight using sticks. But that one, it was more of determining who's stronger, but without the, what you call it, to kill each other. It is more of fighting, like checking who's had the strength and so forth. But to these young people, which is something even myself, after I finished my study, trying to understand why do you fight? Because when they go and fight and to have these matches, back in their minds, like we're going to kill. Someone has to die. So according to them, that is a win. They go there not to lose, but in order to win is to kill one member of your opponents. So it has changed how the meanings based on the young people that who are doing this violence. It's no longer about, let's check, okay, who has the strength as part of the game, but not killing each other. But for them, the goal is to kill each other in order to check who's powerful than the other.
I don't know. Okay, so we have Versha in the room, and then Amanda just can follow up after that.
So thank you, Sisanda, for a brilliant presentation. I have about 400 questions, but I'm going to stick with one. So I think from what you've said, the age group is quite young, and then as they sort of grow from late teens, early 20s, they sort of age. What happens then? That's my question. So after that intense age period, what happens? Assuming that you don't die a violent death, where do you go? Do you graduate to grown-up gangs? I mean, where do you go?
So after, let's say, if you have decided to leave, right, to stop being part of Guran, some of them is either they just stop altogether, and some of them they don't join any gangs, because there won't be any gangs within. They don't join any gangs. It's either they become isikoli, where both they've learned that during Gurans, right? Because some of them, they had to have money to consult traditional healers. So some of them, they'll go and mark people on the trains or on the streets. But now as they leave Gurans, some of them, they continue with that habit. They continue the habit of marking people on the street, but they don't join any gangs because there won't be other gangs that are within the community.
So I know, I'm sorry, I'll stop now. But do you think that's a possibility, that there will be sort of a birth of a next level gang or a next level violence, criminal empire kind of thing?
There is a possibility. For some of them, they got arrested because of certain reasons. Some they become more violent. And one of the young people mentioned that he raped and he was arrested for raping. Some of them, he was arrested for killing outside being part of Gurans. So some of them, they grow to an extent that they become violent criminals, dangerous violent criminals. For example, some of these young people that I interviewed, which I interviewed 10 of them, I can say only probably 5 of them are left now. Some of them, they were killed through mob justice. Some of them, they were killed while maybe walking because they were still stigmatized being part of Gurans. But the nice thing, some of them, which I've seen, that they changed their lives. Some, they went back to school, and some opened businesses. And actually one of them said to me, he told my sisters that after I did the research with them, he started a business of cleaning sneakers. And which for me, I felt that this probably was a stage that these young people were in, which I still, at this stage, I still don't understand why they decided to create such groups within like Kailicha.
Amanda, do you want to ask your question? And then I know Irvin has one too.
Yes, thank you very much for that presentation. I think it was a really, really interesting presentation dealing with many fascinating things, and I would love to read your PhD, especially also to read many of the recommendations, the issues that you didn't touch on. But I've got a couple of questions. So firstly, you talked about the different groupings, which are based on the location of where the groupings are located. But I wondered also if there are any other particular identity or cultural identifiers for each grouping, so that they can, so that the youth can identify with a particular group. You know, is there a so-called moral code or something, a different moral code for each group? And then I think, like the previous person, I also just wanted to explore the linkage between violence that occurs outside the Gurans and violence that happens within the Gurans and the code of honor within the Gurans. So whether they are sometimes happening in parallel, so that you might get groupings going off and committing crime or robberies, or even becoming involved in the extortion rackets that we're seeing emerging in those areas. And then lastly, I think the question is really, you gave some broad recommendations around how to intervene in this area, but do you have any thoughts around particular kinds of interventions that might be effective, and who should lead or who should be involved in those processes? Thank you.
In terms of how they identify themselves within these groups, it was not, what can I say? It was not explicit as what they mentioned in terms of location, but they briefly, some of them, which is, I can say, 2% of those young people, they mentioned that a certain way of, like, for example, using caps. If you're wearing an orange cap, you belong to a certain group from a different location. So they did build some meanings in terms of how the clothes that they put on as well, but and also the signs they do in their hands. For example, some will do this kind of signs to show that you are Gurans, or some of them, I think in the picture that you've seen, you put your hands in the bag to show that you belong in this kind of Gurans group. And those are the only, but other than that, there was nothing that actually will make these young people identify, even when they find you in a certain location, because it's funny that they will recognize if you didn't belong in their groups. If you were walking in a certain location, they'll see that you're a voter, you'll see that you're an Italian. I'm not sure it's because they've seen each other walking in those locations in order to identify. And also in terms of linkages with these groups outside Gurans, most of these young people, I might be wrong. I've not seen them, or also, I've not seen them belonging to certain groups besides the Gurans, or becoming part of groups that are set up to, let's say, for example, what we're seeing now, certain group who are protecting the Somalian shops in, for example, in Township. Most of them, because since they are young, they don't get involved in the older kind of gang groupings where they set a group for a certain economic benefit, or for example, xenophobia and so forth. So they're not that kind of groups, even outside the Gurans groupings. I'm not sure whether I've answered, Amanda. In terms of recommendations, I believe that the community needs to play a bigger role. Because in my findings, I realized that the community, according to them, it was more of we're trying to solve the problem that we have in the community of young people killing each other. But also there was a division within the community. There was community members who wanted to solve this problem by disciplining these young people, for example, taxi drivers who will beat up these young people in order to stop them from fighting. But there was, at the same time, there were community members who took these kids to traditional healers in order for them to protect them. But that increased the chances of young people staying in Gurans instead of stopping, because they were being protected by traditional healers. But also there were these communities who came up with interventions where these young people, they should be, it was like religious structures where they should go to church and etc. So there's a division within the community itself. So in part of the intervention that I think should be looked at, in looking at how the community is set up, how these people are responding to violence, is there any social cohesion that is happening within the communities? And also the families, because I think something that we have not actually looked at it thorough in terms of how the families, what can I say, the attention that young people get from their families, because some of these young people, they don't have the attention from their families, they don't understand. Because when I was speaking to the community members, they know nothing about what is happening with their kids. The only thing they hear when the kid has been involved in a certain violent activities. So those interventions, I think, starting from family to community before going to the government to come up with solutions. I think working with families using a bottom-up approach, I think that might be our good starting point in order for us to really find ways in mitigating violence in those communities.
Thank you, Sisanda. I knew Irvin was going to have a question, probably 10. And after that, Kagiso will turn over to you. And then, Andrew, you're welcome to ask your follow-up question after that.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Sisanda. I was really impressed with your research. I think you've complemented a lot of other researchers, and you've kind of begun to answer fundamental questions about what it is that we see developing. And I do want to take you up on the question, is this a gang? Because you asked that question. And I think it's an important question. I do think that all the hallmarks are there, all the ingredients are there for you to begin to call it a gang, because there has been some research on the Vuras and the Vatos gangs before. I think what the most important thing for me and the takeaway that I get from your research is that this violence is not organized. And I think we must pay heed and we must pay attention to that, particularly as it relates to policy, and that these young people get together as adolescents and at times of matric balls or times when communities congregate, they exercise this violence. But it's possible that it could be grown and that they could be recruited into other gangs in the longer term. So I did want to just maybe, following on from Amanda's question, look at what your policy recommendations are, because I don't know when the last time, when last we got together to look at the youth policy and look at developing policies that work for young people. Maybe just your comments on that. Thanks.
Can I just add one tiny note to what Irvin said? Because I'm curious. But the violence is not for any benefit. It's not about territory of selling drugs or extortion. Is that a gang? If it's not, there's no tangible, it just seems to be a game.
Performative.
Yeah.
But it's a performance. And I get that that's often a part of a gang, but if that doesn't, in my understanding, that's not what a gang is for generally. I don't.
True. Don Pinnock wrote about this in his own work as part of the rites of passage. And in lots of the colored communities, this type of thing happened. But a lot of the more violent elements within that group were the ones that eventually graduated to lead gangs. And Don Pinnock raised this as being part of the stronger adolescents within the group, force their way as leaders, and they emerge as the leaders of new gangs. So he's done that research some time ago, but the fact that you say it's seasonal, it's something that we must take note of. And I think that these are your findings, and we must have a look at it. And I think we must learn from it, because that is the most surprising finding that all of us can learn from. So thank you, Annie.
I also think it's really interesting that you say that they find safety in violence, right? I mean, that there's a tremendous irony. And as Sukisi Gaba points out in the chat, which you can't see because it's behind you, he says that the Gurans are products of their circumstances of social alienation. So I think that all of those things do invite us to engage much more with that. Kagiso, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Sisanda, my question around the criminal justice system playing a part of deterrence towards this. I mean, you have expressed that this kids start off at an early age. Was there any view expressed by some of them as to why is there so that, you know, the fear of being in conflict with the law, why is that not deterring them from, you know, going through? Why is there so that there's no any view expressed to say that either, you know, the thought of ending up in jail or in prison, you know, it's a form of deterrence of some sort? Is there complete disregard of the criminal justice system all in all, or is a view that it is ineffective and therefore we can do as we please? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kagiso. I think the question of the policies looking at the Chinese policy, I'll go some at the time because I don't trade it. I'll just answer Kagiso's question regarding the criminal justice. I mean, that is also part of what I got from the participants when I asked them, they've mentioned that the communities, yes, they are divided, but the police, they have not played part in making sure this violence is mitigated within the community. So they felt that the criminal justice is ineffective, and so it was, they can get away with anything. Like, for example, some of the young people, including the teachers also, they mentioned that these young people, they don't even get arrested. Even when they are seen fighting, and the police will be there, which is in some cases as well. I was there in one of their fights while they were fighting. It was during metric ball, right? And one of the young people that I interviewed, they called me like, okay, come if you want to see what is happening, come and see what is happening. And when I went there, right, the police were there, the police van were there flickering, but they were not doing anything. They were just watching, including the community members. The only people that managed to disperse these young people, it was taxi drivers when they came and started shooting on the sky so that these young people, they can disperse. But the police, they did not do anything. So that is why some of these young people, they were not arrested because they were part of the Gurans, but those who were arrested, they were arrested because of the things that they did on the side. As I've mentioned, some because of rape, because of robbing the people in the community. But being part of the Gurans, some of them, majority actually, they've never got arrested. So I think there's the part that, I mean, something that has been seen also, I think has been touched also in the literature about trying to investigate the effectiveness of the criminal justice within those communities, because the community members also, they felt that they are not doing anything. They're just useless, and if the criminal justice was doing something, making sure it disciplined these young people, those kind of social groups within those communities will never happen. But there's a lot of ineffectiveness that is happening in terms of the police, how they respond to this kind of violence.
So thank you, everyone. On that note, Sisanda, thank you for a fascinating presentation. I hope you will get to see all of the comments in the chat about how relevant, how interesting, how topical, how much your work requires us all to think more and differently about what we're currently doing. And as you know, it fits very well into what the Center of Criminology is currently thinking about is, what do we think of beyond kind of state institutions? How do we both preserve state institutions, but also think about how we think about justice, safety, violence beyond that. So thank you very much for adding such richness to that conversation. Just because I always get to add on a commercial, I hope that you will always come, but also all attend our next seminar, which will be on the 30th of August. And it's a conversation between Sisanda Steedman and colleagues from SERI and from the SJC on exactly this kind of question. Where do we go beyond the police? Building on Sisanda's book, Can We Be Safe? We'll also be selling copies of the book here, not the center, but Sisanda's people. So please do come, bring some money if you're interested in buying the book, and continue this conversation with us. Thank you very much, Sisanda. I know you were super nervous. I know you tried to get out of doing this 10 times, but I, for one, am very happy that you didn't. And I really look forward to continuing these conversations. Very well done. Thank you, everybody. If you're not yet on the Center of Criminology's mailing list, please look us up, get on the list, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
So I'm like